August 1944, the Falaise Pocket in France. A German general, his uniform remarkably clean amidst the wreckage, surrenders to a battle-weary British captain. The terms are agreed upon, his men are disarming, but the surrender is not complete. The captain points to the general's holstered Luger. The sidearm must be handed over. The general's expression hardens. He refuses. For a few silent, tense seconds, the entire truce is in jeopardy. A firefight could erupt at any moment, all because a defeated officer will not surrender a symbol of his honor. This was not an isolated standoff. From the fields of Normandy to the forests of the Ardennes, this dangerous negotiation played out again and again. It was a collision of two irreconcilable worlds. For the German officer corps, steeped in tradition, a sidearm was not merely a weapon, it was the last vestige of personal honor, and its surrender was a humiliation beyond defeat itself. But for the battle-hardened Allied soldier, the rule was brutally simple. An armed enemy is a threat. This raises a stark question. Why would a defeated commander risk a final, pointless firefight over a pistol? To find the answer, we must first understand the two completely different rulebooks that governed their actions. For the British Tommy or American GI of 1944, the world had been boiled down to a brutal calculus of survival. He was not a philosopher, he was a professional, hardened by years of combat. His training, and more importantly, his experience, had taught him one unshakable truth. The most dangerous moment of any engagement is the surrender itself. The seconds between an enemy raising his hands and being fully disarmed are a vacuum where anything can happen. A feigned capitulation, a hidden grenade, a final, desperate shot from a pistol. The Allied procedure for taking prisoners was therefore not a negotiation. It was a drill, as cold and impersonal as assembling a rifle. Drop all weapons, hands up, move to the collection point. Every step was designed to eliminate risk. An officer's rank meant nothing in this moment. A general's pistol fired the same 9mm round as a private's. The order was absolute. Strip every prisoner of everything that could be used as a weapon. It wasn't about humiliation. It was about ensuring that the man processing the prisoners would live to do it again tomorrow. For the Allied soldier, a surrendered German was a problem to be managed, not an honorable foe to be saluted. But for the German officer, this cold, efficient process was a profound violation. Steeped in a military tradition stretching back to the Prussia of Frederick the Great, his identity was fused to his rank and its symbols. The concept of Kriegerehre, or warrior's honor, dictated that an officer who had fought with distinction was owed respect, even in defeat. In past wars, it was not uncommon for a vanquished officer to be allowed to retain his sidearm as a mark of that respect. This sidearm was rarely a standard-issue piece of equipment. Often, it was a privately purchased Luger P08 or Walther PPK, sometimes a family heirloom passed down through generations of soldiers. It was the physical embodiment of his authority, his social standing, and his personal honor. To surrender his army was a military reality, but to surrender his personal pistol to a common enlisted man, a man he viewed as his social and military inferior, was an intimate, personal degradation. It was the final stripping away of his identity, leaving him as just another defeated man in a dirty uniform. Here, then, were two worlds, utterly blind to each other's logic. One side, guided by a pragmatic doctrine of survival, saw an unacceptable risk. The other, bound by a centuries-old code of honor, saw an unbearable insult. There was no room for compromise. The Allied soldier could not bend the rules that kept him alive. The German officer could not easily surrender the last symbol of who he was. As the Allied armies pushed into France in the summer of 1944, these two opposing philosophies were set on a collision course. The first mass surrenders of the war in the West were about to test which would break first, the procedure of the victor or the pride of the vanquished. The collision came in the dense hedgerows of Normandy in the brutal summer of 1944. As Allied forces broke through the German lines, the first mass surrenders on the Western Front began. German officers, emerging from shattered bunkers or surrounded pockets of resistance, expected a semblance of order. Many had mentally rehearsed the moment, prepared to meet an Allied counterpart, officer to officer. Instead, they were met by exhausted, wary infantrymen, privates and sergeants who had just lost friends in the preceding firefight. Accounts from the period are strikingly consistent. An officer would attempt to state his rank and unit, only to be cut off. The demand for Waffen runter, weapons down, was followed not by a salute, but by the cold muzzle of a rifle. Protests about honor, about the rights of an officer to retain his sidearm, were met with blank stares or a shove against the nearest wall. The systematic search was rough, fast, and impersonal. For the German commanders, this was a profound shock. Their world, built on rank and deference, was being dismantled not by an enemy general, but by a common soldier who saw only a potential threat. But this harsh, impersonal procedure wasn't born from malice. It was a protocol written in blood, a direct response to the lethal realities of a war where a moment's hesitation or a single hidden pistol could be the difference between life and death. And as thousands more prepared to surrender in the weeks to come, this brutal frontline doctrine would be tested again and again. The protocol was a grim ballet, choreographed by years of hard-won experience. It began with a shouted command, universal in its intent. One soldier, the cover, would keep his rifle trained on the prisoners. His only job was to watch their hands and eyes. A second soldier, the searcher, would then move in. The orders were specific. The prisoner was to be placed off balance, hands against a wall or a vehicle, legs spread wide. The search was not a polite pat-down. It was a methodical, invasive sweep. First, the waistband, for pistols or grenades, then the pockets, the ankles, for a hidden knife. The searcher would remove the prisoner's belt, less for the buckle as a weapon, and more to prevent its use for self-harm or strangling a guard. In many units, standard procedure also dictated removing a prisoner's boots. A boot could conceal a small blade, and a shoeless man was far less likely to run. Every step was a response to a lesson learned in blood. There was no room for courtesy, only for a cold, life-saving routine. For the German officers subjected to this process, the shock was profound. It was a complete inversion of their world. In his post-war memoirs, a former Wehrmacht major describes the moment he was disarmed in Normandy. He doesn't write about fear, but about a burning, disorienting shame. His captor, a young American private, roughly pulled a ceremonial dagger from his belt, a family heirloom carried by his father in the Great War. He wrote, "The boy who took it could not have known what it was. He saw only a knife. He did not see 100 years of service. In that moment, I was no longer an officer. I was simply a thing to be processed." This sentiment echoes through dozens of diaries and letters. The words change: undignified, insulting, barbaric, but the underlying grievance is the same. They were not being treated as vanquished warriors, but as common criminals. Some tried to reason, to appeal to a higher authority they assumed must exist. In a documented incident near the town of Mortain in August 1944, a German colonel, surrounded with his staff, attempted to negotiate the terms of his surrender with an American lieutenant. Citing the 1929 Geneva Convention, he argued that, as an officer, he was entitled to retain his personal sidearm. He was not entirely wrong. The convention did suggest that officers could keep their sidearms as a mark of rank, but what the colonel, in his desperate legal argument, either didn't know or chose to ignore was the crucial exception. This custom was permitted unless the capturing army's high command specifically ordered otherwise, and Allied Supreme Headquarters had issued just such an order. General Eisenhower's policy was absolute. For the safety of Allied troops, no captured enemy personnel, regardless of rank, were to remain armed. The American lieutenant on the ground knew nothing of diplomatic subtleties. He knew his orders. The colonel's pistol was a threat, and the argument was over. The pistol was confiscated. This clash of rules created even more dangerous standoffs when rank itself became the weapon. Near Aachen, as the Siegfried Line began to crumble, a German Hauptmann, a captain, attempted to surrender his unit. As an American sergeant moved forward to disarm him, the captain held up his hand, refusing to surrender his Walther pistol to an enlisted man. "An officer," he declared in broken English, "surrenders to an officer." For a few tense seconds, the surrender stalled. The American sergeant was now in an impossible position. His own men were watching. The German soldiers were watching. If he backed down and called for his lieutenant, he would lose authority, and every future surrender would become a negotiation. If he forced the issue too aggressively, the proud, cornered German officer might prefer a final, pointless act of defiance. The sergeant made a choice. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his rifle. He simply stood his ground, looked the captain in the eye, and said, "Sir, around here, I'm the one who takes the guns." After a long, silent moment, the German captain slowly unbuckled his holster and handed it over. The fragile piece held. But while this brutal pragmatism dominated the front lines, a different, more complicated story was unfolding further up the chain of command. But this ironclad rule of the front line wasn't the whole story. A strange duality existed within the Allied command itself. While the infantryman was trained to see every armed German as a mortal threat, some senior Allied commanders, men from the same military aristocratic tradition as their counterparts, viewed the situation through a different lens. They understood the symbolic power of an officer's sidearm. This created a starkly different reality away from the front. In documented post-surrender meetings, after a German general had been safely processed and disarmed, an Allied general might perform a quiet act of courtesy. At the formal surrender of the Lorient fortress in May 1945, the German commander, General Wilhelm Farnbacher, was disarmed according to protocol, but later, the American commander, Major General Harry Maloney, returned Farnbacher's pistol, a gesture of respect from one professional to another once the danger had passed. This was the paradox. The private on the line enforced a rule to stay alive, while a general in the rear could afford a moment of chivalry. But this gentleman's agreement was a luxury of safety. In the chaos of a collapsing front, it would never be the general who made the choice. It would be the soldier on the spot, staring down an officer who refused to surrender his final symbol of honor. And so, all these threads, procedure, honor, risk, and rank, converge on a single moment in the final, desperate hours of the Falaise Pocket. August 20th, 1944. A British major from the 15th Scottish Division stands before General Lieutenant Otto Elfelt, commander of the German 84 Corps. Elfelt is defeated. His men, hundreds of them, are surrounded, exhausted, and ready to surrender. The terms are set, but the general refuses to hand over his pistol. The air goes still. The watching German soldiers, armed and on a knife's edge, look to their commander for a signal. The British major, with only a small security detail, understands that one wrong move, one shouted order, could reignite a massacre. He does not raise his rifle. He does not appeal to a higher authority. Instead, he looks the general in the eye and speaks with the cold, clear logic of the front line. "Sir, for you, the war is over. My orders are to ensure it stays that way for my men. The pistol or the surrender is void." It is not a threat. It is a statement of procedure, a final, non-negotiable term. An endless silence hangs over the ruined landscape. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that seems to take an eternity, General Elfelt unbuckles his entire pistol belt and holster. He holds it out. The tension breaks. The surrender is real. The quiet exchange of that pistol belt was the true end of the battle. The question of the sidearm was never really about the weapon itself. It was a microcosm of the war's fundamental, irreversible change. This was the final death of an obsolete, romanticized vision of warfare, a contest between a professional, aristocratic officer class, where personal honor could hold as much weight as a strategic objective. That tradition, born in a different century, was simply incompatible with the reality of total industrial war. The Allied soldiers' insistence was not an act of disrespect. It was the final, necessary lesson learned over 5 years of brutal conflict. On a modern battlefield, procedure is paramount, and sentiment is a fatal liability. The surrender wasn't complete. The truce wasn't real until the last symbol of that older, more personal code of honor was finally set aside, replaced by the cold, impersonal logic that would define the rest of the war and the century that followed. In the end, the lesson was clear. The most dangerous weapon on a collapsing front was not the tank shelling a distant line or the machine gun holding a final position. It was the centuries-old idea of honor, loaded into the chamber of a single officer's pistol.